When you hear the phrase get good, what type of game comes to mind first? You might be tempted to say Souls games, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, the series is known for being difficult, the fans love talking about how difficult the games are, and if you complain about the difficulty, they take you out back to have a nice civil discussion. Game hard, and the only way to win is to hit buttons better. This mentality has become increasingly prevalent in single-player games, but it's hardly ever the case. In a PvE setting, players often have multiple ways to approach that environment, and developers will throw a bone to less skilled players. Whether it's through difficulty settings, accessibility options, or powerful builds, getting good rarely ever means just getting good. The only subset of games where it should mean just that is multiplayer games, where difficulty serves as a great equalizer. If player skill is to be the deciding factor in matches, everyone needs to be on a level playing field. You can't start a chess match with a few extra queens because your opponent is Magnus Carlsen. I mean, you could, but that wouldn't quite be the same game. Everybody has the same options available to them, but not everybody will use them as effectively. Picking up a new multiplayer game means throwing yourself in the ring with people who have hundreds, if not thousands more hours than you. Despite this barrier to entry, competitive multiplayer titles consistently maintain some of the highest player numbers, and it's not because they're all playing at the highest level. Although you might hear the occasional complaint about sweats or meta slaves quote-unquote ruining the game, there's a general understanding that players competing for money are playing in a vastly different environment than the average Joe. Your little cousin Timmy is not going pro off that Fortnite clip. Even with how unforgiving the multiplayer experience can be, most players are content to engage with it on a casual level. But for some reason, that same sentiment doesn't seem to extend to fighting games.
How is that even fair? You're just button mashing, Clip. There's no skill to that.
When it comes to fighting games, sweating is seen as the default. You can't just dabble, you gotta eat, sleep, and breathe this shit to even think about booting up. Despite the popularity of franchises like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, the genre as a whole still remains relatively niche. There's a reason why for their latest licensed multiplayer game, Marvel went with a free-to-play team-based hero shooter, and not a new fighter. The game wouldn't have seen a fraction of the Marvel Rivals player count, or more importantly, its revenue. Money talks, and Rivals players have been yapping like crazy. There's just something about fighting games that makes them less approachable to new players than other multiplayer games, but it's not for a lack of trying. For years now, developers like Capcom and Arc System Works have been making an effort to make their fighting games appeal to a wider demographic. With more comprehensive tutorials, free-to-play versions, battle passes and daily rewards, better single-player content, marketing campaigns aimed at players that have never touched one of these games. Is that Ronaldo? But the most contentious change has been a recent trend to do away with the genre's most integral system mechanic, motion inputs. In fighting games, each character has a number of special moves that are accessed by the player inputting a sequence of directions, forming a motion, followed by a button press. It's a simple concept on paper, but a bit harder in practice, especially when those motions start getting more extravagant. Street Fighter was the first game to introduce specials tied to directional inputs, and while it's not the first fighting game, it's the first one that mattered. Well, not this one, this one. Street Fighter 2 laid the groundwork and would serve as the blueprint for every fighting game that came after. Street Fighter 2 likes, if you will. Of course, its unique method of inputting special moves would also be widely adopted to where it's now ubiquitous throughout the genre. Small problem though, most people aren't trying to do all that.
What the fuck? These combos hard as hell!
Alright, here go the ultra right here. XXAABBYY. Throw the controller 2 times?
Motion inputs are undoubtedly one of the biggest factors that make fighters unwelcoming to new players, and contribute to the idea that these games are just harder. To those on the outside looking in, it's easy to view them as just another archaic relic of dated game design, something that's just there because it's always been there. It made sense when trying to fit more unique attacks on arcade cabinets with only 6 buttons. Now they just serve as an unnecessary barrier to entry. But to those in the fighting game community, or FGC, motion inputs in the genre are inseparable. So much so that removing them can ship of Theseus your game into something that many would hesitate to even consider to be a fighting game. The difficulty these games present is overstated by people who refuse to give them a fair shake, and fans don't want to see the genre they know and love change to attract an audience that had no interest to begin with. Every other week, there's some discourse in the FGC comparing the difficulty found in fighting games to those of other competitive multiplayer titles, and rejecting the idea that their games are substantially more difficult. Shooters don't just hand out free headshots. MOBAs require that you familiarize yourself with hundreds of characters and a million different team comps, yet only fighting games are maligned for their difficulty. As somebody who's more than dabbled in all of these genres, I think these comparisons are a bit of an apples to oranges type situation. Pancakes and waffles even. Fighting games are not any harder than those other genres, but they absolutely do present a type of challenge that's unique to them. Difficulty is not a binary slider with easy on one side and hard on the other. It comes in different flavors, with executional difficulty being the type most associated with fighters. Shooters may favor players with quick reactions and pinpoint accuracy, but none of that is required to interface with the fundamental mechanics of the game. There's no executional barrier to firing your gun or aiming down sights. Landing headshots is an optimization of those two basic actions. Less skilled players still have the option to spray and pray. A lack of skill doesn't stop your bullet from leaving the barrel. In a fighting game, if you can't input the motions for your specials, those moves effectively don't exist to the player. There's a difference in how players perceive things that are hard to do and things that are hard to do well. I'm not that good at shooters, nor do I really care to be. I don't even touch ranked. My time with these games is mostly spent either with friends or with something playing on the second monitor. The genre doesn't demand much from players looking to engage with it on such a casual level. I don't need to study the ancient scriptures of Ninja Fortnite to get a victory royale. I aim and I shoot. Games with heroes, agents, and operators tend to follow a similar format. Each character has a basic attack or primary fire, and a set of unique abilities that are accessed by just pressing a single button. The difficulty is focused not on making those abilities come out of your character, but in the player's capacity to efficiently use them to their greatest effect. Every player being able to execute them is a foregone conclusion. Try playing a hero shooter and telling your teammate who's asking for heals that you're having trouble with the input, and watch him call you slurs that you didn't even know existed. Another type of difficulty often conflated with motion inputs is
knowledge.
MOBAs are a genre known for the sheer volume of information needed to even understand what's happening on the screen. League of Legends has 170 playable characters with more than twice as many purchasable items, all of which have unique synergies that you have to consider. Game knowledge is the easiest kind of difficulty to understand, since it just comes down to whether you do or don't know something. Do you know what this character does? No? Then die. It also occurs the most naturally, since you'll obviously learn more by just playing the game, even if you don't make a dedicated effort. Over time, you'll pick up on things like characters' abilities, why certain builds work, and even the local dialect. If you've never played League, the words on the screen might as well be hieroglyphs.
If I queue into a Luke, basically if you see me in solo queue in Street Fighter, like, I'm just a free win. Like,
chat, what is solo queue? Does that mean soliloquy?
Coming into your chat or from the pros that you were practicing with.
Is that like a League thing, soliloquy?
across the last week, just like either playing solo queue.
Keep saying it.
Where I was, like,
Yeah, stop saying it. He cannot stop.
The difficulty presented by needing deep game knowledge is largely removed from the executional challenge in MOBAs. Being able to identify a team's strengths and weaknesses may influence your decision making, but it won't make you pilot your champion any better. When I first played League, I had the most atrocious builds known to man, but I was still having a good time just pressing buttons and watching my character do cool shit. I was obviously losing more than I was winning, but I had immediate access to all of my chosen character's abilities. Of course, there are more challenging champions, but the average character demands far less from the player than the average Street Fighter. It's not uncommon to see pro League players juggling a dozen champions, but even the best fighting game players tend to stick to just one character, with the occasional secondary. And with hero shooters, switching characters is so fundamental to the game that they let you do it in the middle of a match. MOBAs can place such a heavy emphasis on game knowledge because less is placed on execution. Games are decided by tracking enemy cooldowns, vision control, manipulating minion waves, securing objectives, and generally making educated plays on the map. Hitting buttons good is nice, but it'll never carry you. MOBAs are difficult, just not in the same way, which is why any attempt to directly compare the genres just falls flat to me. Juggling hundreds of items and character abilities is closer to knowing frame data in fighting games than it is to motion inputs. Landing headshots in shooters is akin to having proper spacing in whiff punishing. There really isn't anything in either genre that closely emulates the challenge presented by motion inputs. Fighting games are not inherently harder, but they are uniquely challenged in a way that makes them less approachable to new players. It's really not that hard to see where the friction is coming from. An inability to reliably input motions doesn't just result in fewer shots landing, it's a complete non-starter. With enough attempts, anybody will eventually be able to throw a fireball in the training room. Even a dog could do it, as so many will kindly point out to you, but that's not representative of what the game demands from the player. Street Fighter is not a game where you throw one fireball and all the NPCs start clapping and it rolls credits. You'll need to be able to do that motion reliably, on reaction, and in the middle of combos. You can do a fireball? Cool, now hit 10 of those in 5 seconds. Much of the difficulty is front-loaded, asking more from the player sooner, and resulting in an exceptionally high skill floor. A game's skill floor represents the minimum amount of skill needed to achieve competence, whereas the skill ceiling is the absolute limit that it can be taken. Chess is a game with a fairly low skill floor. Once you grasp the rules and what each piece does, you don't need much more to start playing, but the skill ceiling is something that even the best players haven't even come close to. At least not the human ones. Low floors are more beginner friendly, while low ceilings don't leave much room for skill expression, leaning more on random chance or heavy-handed comeback mechanics. I think that any competitive game worth its salt should have a substantial disparity between its ceiling and floor. If you want the sweats grinding ranked, there's gotta be some meat on the bone, something to sink your teeth into and exhibit mastery over the game's systems. So it stands to reason that any change to increase this disparity also increases competitive merit. So why not just lower the skill floor and in turn add more room for skill expression? In practice, changes aimed at the lowest level of play almost always have some effect on the highest. If any FPS game was to introduce a lock-on feature, the ranked ladder would shift dramatically. Aiming, while straightforward, is a core skill that separates players at every level. Its removal would completely strip ranked titles of their current meaning, as greater emphasis would then be shifted to different skills. That shift is something that developers can lean into, but the game has to be built around it. Attempts to lower the skill floor have to minimize their impact on anyone that's not a beginner to be effective solutions. A good example of this is a change made to League of Legends in a 2022 patch. The Fog of War is a feature in MOBAs that obscures the enemy team's actions from the player. Each team only has vision of the immediate area surrounding allied units and structures. Wards are an item that you can place down to maintain vision of any given area on the map. MOBAs are largely games of information warfare. Tracking where the enemy has vision and moving undetected is at the heart of that. As of patch 12.22, if you see an enemy place down a ward and ping the location, it spawns a timer at that location for the entire duration that the ward remains. This is definitely a change that makes the game easier, but not in any way that meaningfully shifts its balance. Players at the highest level were already properly tracking enemy vision, so this addition doesn't change much for them. Revealing wards doesn't guarantee that beginner to intermediate players will make the right calls with that information. Additionally, to mark the area, you have to see the ward being placed. Most calls around vision are made based on inference, such as seeing an enemy leave the map, return shortly after, and deducing that they warded the area. There's still room for skill expression, but some friction was removed at lower levels to ease the onboarding process. Motion inputs are uniquely challenging to simplify. Although they pose the greatest barrier as a beginner, there's still a factor that influences decision making even at the professional level. These games are built from the ground up with motion inputs in mind, and they dictate not only how they have to be played, but also how they're balanced. In the first Street Fighter, special moves were disgustingly overpowered, ending most fights in just 3 to 4 hits. But the inputs were incredibly strict, offering no buffer or leniency. Capcom treated special moves almost like a cheat code, neglecting to even mention their existence in the arcade manual. They were a reward for experimentation, and their high damage was justified by their demanding execution. As motion inputs became more prominent throughout the genre, the timing became more lenient and the damage was tuned accordingly, but the specific inputs continued to inform the design of the attacks. How strong any given special move can be is directly tied to the motion needed to execute it, and that's true even for those earliest inputs introduced in Street Fighter 1. Of course, by which I mean...
Bom dia, galera, vamos que vamos! Hadouken! Oi, Hadouken!
The Hadouken, or more generally Fireball, is executed by pressing down, down forward, and forward, followed by a punch button. The Shoryuken, or Dragon Punch, uses a similar input but starts on forward rather than ending with it. If you've never touched a fighting game, you might be wondering why I'm saying forward and not right. And that's because the direction is relative to your opponent. Whenever you're on the right side, the inputs are mirrored. This is why characters and fighters are always facing each other. Blocking is done by holding away from your opponent, either with back or down back. The Hadouken is effective at controlling horizontal space, while the Shoryuken covers vertical. Fireballs put a moving hitbox between you and your opponent that they have to deal with before they get to you. The obvious answer is to jump, which you can then answer with a Dragon Punch, which is entirely invincible to attacks from the air. air. The combination of these two attacks sounds overpowered, but their strength is kept in line by how they're executed. Looking back at their inputs, we can see that neither special allows you to hold a defensive direction while performing them. Throwing a fireball requires a quarter circle towards your opponent, which opens you up to a jump in. To anti-air the jumping opponent with a DP, you have to start by first walking towards them, and that moment of vulnerability is what keeps it from being overpowered. High risk, but also high reward. In theory, both motions can be done in just 3 frames or 1/20th of a second, but no human is consistently performing them that fast. Fireballs and dragon punches that you could do from a defensive position would have to be designed incredibly differently, and that's exactly what Capcom did with Instead of executing a motion as quickly as possible, Guile's Sonic Boom and Flash Kick are done by holding back and down respectively for a set period of time before pressing the opposite direction along with the corresponding button. Holding down back, the most defensive position, allows him to charge both simultaneously. Nothing is more menacing than a Guile player just sitting there holding down back. By essentially putting a down payment on his specials, Guile gets access to them with the press of a single button and direction. Since charge characters have to charge for so long, they typically boast fireballs that are outright better than their motion using contemporaries, having less startup and recovering faster. Their charge identity also informs other aspects of their design. They'll often have attacks that let them move while maintaining charge, or specials that last a long time, so players have time to charge a different special during the animation. You can find this kind of depth and detail in just about every single motion. Super moves are even more powerful than specials, and fittingly have more complex inputs and properties that are consistent with their requirements. Some can only be done in the air, some can only stop attacks from the air, some can teleport you full screen, but almost all of them feature some kind of invincibility. Zangief is a big body grappler that loves nothing more than to blow your back out for having the audacity to block. His most powerful super is an invincible, unreactable grab that does half of your health. If you see this screen and you're within hugging distance, it doesn't matter if you were blocking, you're already dead. For such a high damage move to bypass the most fundamental defensive mechanic in the game, it needs some restrictions. The input for this super is a 720 motion, requiring that you make 2 full circles with your stick before pressing the punch button. Given that your stick is also tied to movement, it makes this super incredibly hard to do without jumping, so Geef players will hide the input behind the animations of other attacks, baiting a response from the opponent. If you see him doing a whole lot of this, he's up to no good. From how you play as and against any given character, what tools they're allowed to have and how they're balanced, everything is designed while considering motion inputs. They may create a significant barrier to entry, but you can't just get rid of them without anything being lost. Any developer looking to make a more accessible fighting game has to do more than just throw them out and be done with it. The game has to be built from the ground up with that in mind and its mechanics shifted accordingly. That decision will invariably bleed into every facet of its design and make for a markedly different kind of game. And there's no better example than Super Smash Bros. Is a game that plays significantly differently from any traditional fighter, so much so that half the people watching this video just left an angry comment saying it's not a fighting game. Whether you believe it belongs to the genre or not, one thing that's undeniable is its mass appeal. Smash Ultimate is by far the best-selling fighter, followed by Street Fighter II with less than half its numbers, which is then followed by the last Smash game. Developer Masahiro Sakurai is an avid fan of fighting games, but he's well aware of the high skill associated with the genre. In a 2004 interview with Famitsu, he told a story about a time where he was playing King of Fighters 95 at an arcade, and he wiped the floor with his opponent for 2 games straight, but something felt off. When he noticed how unresponsive the other player was, he sneaked a peek at who he was fighting, and he saw a couple sitting behind the other arcade cabinet, with the girlfriend playing the game. Presumably, the couple stopped by the arcade to have a bit of fun, and here he was, sweating on the sticks with his optimal combos. Sakurai felt terrible. Many people attribute this story to his inspiration for creating Smash Bros, but when retelling the story on his YouTube channel, Sakurai himself stated that that's not the case. Whether this is true or not, I think this experience still speaks to his character, and the design philosophy he adopts when developing games. From its inception, Sakurai intended Smash to be a casual game to be played at all skill levels. People may use party game as a derogatory term, but that's exactly how he saw it. Of course, to create a more approachable fighting game, motion inputs had to go, and directional blocking along with it. Naturally, this meant that characters could freely turn around, and blocking was moved to a dedicated button, a change that made the game far more intuitive to those unfamiliar with the genre. A simple way to make your game more accessible to a wider demographic is to use language that gamers are used to seeing in other genres. While it's not something that most of us actively think about, many of the things that we take as a given in video games are only because we've played so many other games and internalized those conventions. A buddy of mine recently picked up Elden Ring. He's not much of a gamer. He plays gun and he plays ball. That's it. Upon entering the open world, he immediately started swinging on the first NPC he saw, not realizing that he was friendly. Unfortunately for him, NPCs in Elden Ring fight back, and he kept respawning and dying to this one NPC. To people who've played an RPG, it's pretty obvious by Vare's innocuous stance and lack of a drawn weapon that he's non-hostile, but that won't occur to somebody who has no experience with similar games. You can imagine his disbelief when I told him that if he wanted absolution, he had to find a specific item, head to a specific church, and speak to the giant tortoise wearing a pope hat. Elden Ring's not a game that cares to accommodate players who don't at least have some passing familiarity with RPG systems. This is another area where shooters are just easier to get into for the vast majority of players. If you played any 3D game in the past 2 decades, it should be immediately apparent that you moved your character with the left stick and the camera with the right. It's a control scheme that's been standardized across nearly every single genre. To a lesser extent, it's also widely accepted that L2 is your aim button and R2 is fire, so much so that these buttons are called triggers. One of the biggest obstacles for fighting games is that they heavily rely on language only found in other fighting games. Many in the FGC take their understanding of these systems for granted and severely underestimate how unintuitive they are to most people. Understanding frame advantage and canceling moves into specials and specials into supers is just not something that easily clicks. Other games obviously have frame data and even punish windows, but none demand that you become as intimately familiar with them as fighting games. Animation canceling is also not unique to fighters, but it mostly exists as a quality of life feature to make gameplay smoother, much like coyote time in many platformers. Given his background and the poster boy of the series, the language that Sakurai most leans on in Smash Bros. Is that of platformers, hence the term platform fighter. The stages typically feature one or more platforms that you can stand on or fall through. Characters all have a double jump and you can influence your momentum in the air. Apart from projectiles, there are hardly any moves that leave you at a frame advantage, meaning that the attacker can move before the defender. Instead, different aspects of fighting games are emphasized. Proper spacing and positioning. Concepts that are easier seen visually and closer to something you'd see in a platformer. To better facilitate this, the stages got bigger and characters got more freedom of movement. The win condition also changed to be more in line with that of the genre. Instead of lowering your opponent's health to 0, you win by knocking them off the stage. Fighting games tend to have anywhere from 3 to 6 different attack buttons, but Sakurai reduced that to just 1 button for attacking and 1 button for specials, with each direction pressed in tandem with a button corresponding to a different move. Since characters could freely turn around, that opened up another slot for an attack aimed away from the direction you're facing. Despite the limited control scheme, each character has at least 13 different attacks and 4 different specials, which is not far off from Street Fighter's minimum of 18 different attacks and 2 specials, and all of that was managed with just 2 buttons. Every aspect that's been simplified is accounted for by building around them and designing the gameplay in such a way to make the most of those mechanics. Smash is inarguably simpler than Street Fighter, but that doesn't stop it from having a deeply complex metagame. Although I couldn't care less about competitive melee, I can appreciate the insane level of skill that's on display in high-level matches, a level not unlike that found in traditional fighters. The only significant difference is found at the lower levels, where Smash has a substantially easier time getting people's foot in the door. While the cast of iconic Nintendo and more recently, non-Nintendo characters sure as hell doesn't hurt, this approachability is an indispensable factor contributing to the game's success. There's no shortage of mechanics or tech for competitive players to grind out and optimize, but the key difference is the level at which you're forced to interact with those systems. Smash actively hides its deeper mechanics from the player, opting to only highlight the bare minimum in its introductory tutorial. because that's all that most players will ever need. The vast majority aren't trying to win a major. You can hop online and match into people with hundreds of hours that still don't know how to fast fall or DI. When Lil Timmy hops off Fortnite and boots up Smash, he's not hitting B reverses or wave bounces. He doesn't even know what the hell that is. Combos exist, but you can play for dozens of hours without using a single one. Smash features a bigger disparity between its highest and lowest levels of play than any other fighting game. While Sakurai doesn't care much for the competitive scene, he acknowledges the wide net cast by his game and takes pride in its ability to accommodate such a varying degree of competition. It's only natural that a niche group of people would want to push the game to its absolute limits, and there's more than enough here for them to chew on. The skill floor was lowered, but it didn't have to come at the expense of the skill ceiling. The removal of motion inputs doesn't have to mean that a fighting game's devoid of complexity, so long as the complexity lost by those simplified elements is taken and placed somewhere else. Perhaps the most frustrating part of the perpetual discourse surrounding motion inputs is how people in the FGC will swear up and down that they're not even hard and people just like to complain, but those same people bemoan the very existence of simple inputs and immediately write off any game with them as a goo goo gaga baby game with no depth or complexity. I hope I'm not the only person who sees the irony here. As I mentioned with Street Fighter, motion inputs are more than just gatekeeping for the hell of it. They inform the design and balance of nearly every single game that features them and absolutely do contribute to their depth, but they're not the only factor from which depth can be derived. Any existing game looking to remove them would have to be heavily adjusted to accommodate the change. Even the addition of something as simple as a dash button can break a game wide open, but there's no reason to believe that a new title explicitly developed around not having them inherently has less depth solely because of their absence. Street Fighter 6 is seen as something of a trailblazer for simplified controls in fighting games, but I think it's an example of one of its more awkward inclusions. At its core, Street Fighter 6 is still very much a game balanced around the existence of motion inputs, and it definitely shows. Instead of going all in on simple inputs or creating a hybrid system, SF6 allows each player to choose whether they want to use the standard classic controls or the new modern controls, which has specials and supers on a dedicated button like in Smash Bros. In exchange for this, they lose access to a few attack buttons, which hurts some characters more than others. Specials and supers performed with modern controls deal 20% less damage than those done traditionally. It's not the most elegant solution, but clearly shows that Capcom considered the increased power level these moves would have with their execution barrier removed. However, their properties remain unchanged, as do the general rules of Street Fighter. One-button DPs are still invincible to all jumping attacks. Supers that teleport across the screen are just as threatening. Making them deal 80% damage doesn't completely offset those strengths, but it's still an attempt to keep them from being overpowered, and it does a decent enough job. There are only two things that stand out as particularly egregious. Modern was designed to allow players to do the cool shit faster, to bypass the immediate barrier to entry and start shooting flames from their hands just as fast and reliably as the players crank in quarter circles. But in actuality, Modern provides an objectively faster way to execute these moves than has ever been possible in the series. Just about every super in the game is performed with 2 quarter circles. Assuming each direction is held for 1 frame, that's 6 frames total. The game's a bit lenient with the inputs, allowing you to skip 1 diagonal, bringing the total down to 5 frames. Whether it's performed by a human or a script, this is the fastest possible speed that a super can be done on Classic. Since everything happens at the press of a button on Modern, those 5 frames drop to just 1. In a genre where the primary unit of time is 1/60th of a second, that's not a negligible difference. This is exacerbated by the fact that most people, even professionals, won't be performing 5-frame supers, further increasing the disparity in startup. Another problem is with charge specials. Capcom knew that 1-button charge moves with no tweaks would be absurd, so you still have to hold down or back to charge in Modern. The only difference is that you don't have to press the opposite direction to execute the corresponding special. This means that you'll always maintain charge and only lose it when the special is actually performed, after which you'll immediately begin charging frame 1, because you never let go of the direction to begin with. You'll never be seeing a Modern Guile hit one of these. What's funny is that a couple years ago, Capcom announced a rule change to their tournaments that banned controllers that were capable of performing charge moves without ever letting go of the charge direction, only to end up adding that feature to the latest Street Fighter. Both of these modern quirks, if you will, do more than just lower the execution barrier. They fundamentally change the dynamics of the game. I'm sure that Capcom is well aware that it's impossible to perfectly balance a control scheme that violates the very rules that the game is built on, but they decided that reaching a broader demographic was worth having that bit of sloppiness, and for the most part, I agree. Street Fighter 6 has reached sales figures that the series hasn't seen in over 3 decades, and that's in no small part due to Capcom's decision to cast a wider net. Modern is the preferred controls for roughly 24% of the player base. Whenever I step into the game's game's multiplayer lobby, I'm always surprised by just how many people's playtime looks like this. Players who primarily play the single player content, or who play multiplayer but don't care to touch ranked, who approach this genre in a similar way that I approach shooters, which is not something that I ever thought would be common in fighting games. I've never touched the game's campaign, I've hardly customized my avatar, but somewhere out there, some modern gamer is having the time of his life thinking that he's texting Chun-Li. And you know what? Power to you, my nigga. Despite modern's inclusion, the vast majority of games will still be determined by skill, not control scheme. If you look at the top of the leaderboards or major top 8s, you'll always see the usual suspects. People who eat, sleep, breathe fighting games and have likely dominated in other titles. John Modern is not going to sneak in just because he can do one-button supers. Ultimately, my main problem with Modern and Street Fighter has more to do with enjoyment than balance. When playing against someone on Modern, you have to approach the match differently. Jumping is almost certainly out of the question. Situations that would normally be checkmate are considerably more uncertain. You see a nasty play and wonder whether your opponent just had a hard read on what you were gonna do. You look up, see that orange M, and realize that was never necessary. Gone are the mind games of seeing a geef whiffing buttons full screen and wondering what inputs he's hiding behind those animations. Seeing a Chun-Li vigorously teabagging and concluding whether it's disrespect or if she's plotting something. None of that is necessary when you can just react faster than the game systems were built to handle. Of course, Modern's not unbeatable, and you can adapt your playstyle accordingly. It's just not a playstyle that I find particularly enjoyable, and it's a product of Modern being more of an afterthought than a foundational element of the game's design. With each new patch, Capcom is still adding new changes across the whole roster just to Modern. I just wish that more was done to accommodate the inclusion of such a control scheme, or better yet, if Street Fighter stayed with just classic controls, since that's clearly what it was built around, and Capcom released a different fighting game aimed at a larger demographic. Though from their perspective, it's not hard to see why they'd want their flagship fighter to appeal to the most people. I think the best implementation of simple inputs in a more traditional fighting game can be found in the Arc System Works developed Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. Unlike Street Fighter, Grand Blue was made from scratch around these controls, and it can be clearly seen in the game's design. Instead of letting players opt into either classic or modern, players have access to both input methods at all times, each with unique benefits. Since input complexity as balance isn't a design convention seen in many other genres, ArcSys leaned on language that's far more prevalent in other multiplayer games: cooldowns. In both single and multiplayer games, it's commonly understood that cooldowns are a balancing method used to limit the power of strong abilities. Particularly powerful ones will have longer cooldowns, and games that let you reduce cooldowns typically require some kind of trade-off. Performing specials in Grand Blue puts them on cooldown, with light versions being the weakest and having the shortest duration, and heavies being the strongest with the longest. In the first game, doing specials with motion inputs put them on a shorter cooldown than if you were to perform them with one button. Certain moves also dealt more damage, giving players who did the technical inputs a distinct advantage over those who didn't. This would be changed in the sequel, Grand Blue Fantasy vs. Rising, where technical inputs would go from being strictly better to more situational. Most light and medium specials were made to have negligible cooldowns, and performing motions no longer reduce them further. Both input methods are functionally the same when comboed into from a cancel, but when done in neutral, technical inputs deal an additional 10% damage. This change proved a bit controversial, but I think it makes sense in the context of how the game's designed. The biggest strength of one-button specials and supers exists in neutral, where you're looking to quickly respond to your opponent's actions and punish their mistakes. But during a combo, you're not under any pressure to react with a DP or invincible super. You're just going through the motions, and if you feel more comfortable doing the technical inputs, you're free to do so. Not to mention that even within combos, some specials are linked into or done from a juggle, not a cancel. So there are still spots where you can optimize your inputs for damage, but it's mostly in a neutral state where you'll be deciding between the speed and reliability of simple inputs or the increased damage of technical. At high levels of play, you'll constantly see players switching between the two input methods to take advantage of their unique strengths. If you're not skilled enough to do the same, or just don't care to, you can stick to the simple inputs and deal less damage. While the difference is definitely noticeable, if you're not the type to bother learning motion inputs, you're probably not going to be optimizing your damage to that degree anyway. It's obvious that the game was designed with simple inputs being the default, and technical controls were solely added to appease more experienced players. The damage on one-button specials gives these nice round numbers, and the motion inputs just slap on a 10% modifier. The game's overall power level was also heavily adjusted. Just like Street Fighter, Rising also has meterless dragon punches, but they're far less powerful in this game. For one, only the medium and heavy versions have any invincibility. DPs are also just slower across the board, meaning they can more easily be baited. Since heavy specials have the longest cooldown, you might be tempted to just anti-air with medium, but this game has air blocking, and only heavy DPs have the unique property of being air unblockable. If you let a medium DP rock on a jumping opponent and they happen to be blocking, you'll eat a fat punish. Your heavy DP will hit them regardless, but you'll have to spend that cooldown. The decision making goes farther than just seeing someone jump and hitting the magic button. Alternatively, every single character has a crouching heavy attack designed to hit jumping opponents. It has no invincibility and requires you to react sooner, but rewards you with far more damage off a single anti-air, taking even more power away from one-button DPs. Grand Blue's lower skill floor was something considered early in its development, which allowed ArcSys to craft far more intentionally designed systems, ones that actually play nice with the new control scheme. The game formerly known as Project L has recently been getting some flack from the FGC for the general lack of communication from Riot and the direction they've been taking the game. Despite the game's lack of motion inputs, it's still rich with complex systems, executional challenges, and combo variety. It's also a 2v2 game with active tags, so they're calling this game the hardest, easiest game ever made, and suggesting that it's a failed attempt at accessibility. Riot removed motion inputs, but somehow made the game even more complex, so how can it possibly succeed? I think this idea misunderstands what it means to lower the skill floor. The goal was never to remove all depth and complexity and create some baby game exclusively made for casuals, but to exhibit that complexity through other systems, to make the difficulty less front-loaded, while still maintaining a high skill ceiling. It's easier to get your foot in the door, but that's about it. That's the goal. From the few hours that I was able to play the game, I can tell that there's definitely some meat on the bone, and the lab monsters will cook up some devious tech once the full game is out, assuming the game ever comes out. Another point of contention has been with the actual buttons needed to play the game, the idea being that dropping motion inputs necessitates the addition of a dedicated special button, which inevitably overcrowds your controller. But fighting games have had too many buttons for some time now, that's why I'm confused. With leverless becoming the norm, pro players have been slowly adopting controllers with more and more buttons, not so they can boot up some Hunter x Hunter Nen Impact, but because it's easier to hit one button than a combination of two. Street Fighter has always been a 6-button fighter, and any other input is a combination of those 6 buttons. Button combinations are a holdover from the arcade era, and most modern fighters let you bind macros for more important combinations. By default, Street Fighter 6 binds macros for drive parry and drive impact, bringing the total to 8 buttons and leaving things like throws and EX moves to be performed the old-fashioned way. The game formerly known as Project L has 6 unique buttons and allows you to bind macros for dash and parry, bringing the total to 8 buttons? Huh? But for some reason, this criticism is exclusively levied at these recent titles. When Fatal Fury had its first open beta, one of the primary complaints was the absence of a macro for the feint command. Players were asking for an additional button. I personally still don't use an FD macro in Guilty Gear Strive because there's just no space left on my controller. Excessive buttons have little to do with simple inputs and largely stems from the genre's roots. Instead of just giving you a Swiss Army knife, fighting games give you different attacks for each situation, occupying more button slots. Grand Blue adds not only a special, but also a guard button and still manages to have a straightforward and intuitive layout. Simpler control schemes will never be inherent indicators of quality or depth. Competent developers can always build within those boundaries and make the most of those limitations. It doesn't guarantee that a game will be worse, but it will inevitably play differently. There are some designs that simply would not work without motion inputs. Capcom wanted Marvel 3's Dante to retain his vast moveset from Devil May Cry, so they went and gave this man 23 different special moves. Motion inputs are the only reason that such a character can work within the boundaries of this game. When Smash Ultimate added Kazuya from Tekken, a series where characters having over 100 moves is the norm, even Sakurai decided that he couldn't properly represent the character with Smash's existing control scheme, and gated several of his moves behind motion inputs, with no easier alternative. Guilty Gear's Gold Lewis Dickinson is a character with one special move with 8 variations. By inputting a half-circle motion, Gold Lewis swings his coffin, with the direction of the swing directly corresponding to the direction of the input. Motion inputs allow for a unique approach to designing characters that cannot be found in other genres. And most importantly of all, this shit is just mad cool. The ultimate defense of motion inputs is honestly just hype moments and aura, and I'd much prefer if people said that than the constant grasping at straws. The fact that it's uniquely challenging is part of the appeal. It brings a special sauce to fighting games with a flavor that I happen to like, but it's not hard to see why it's an acquired taste. Fighters with simple inputs can have their own sauce, some that I even like, but it will never bring the same exact flavor, and I don't want to see that old recipe die out. Developers have a clear incentive to want to see the community grow, but I don't think that's worth stripping this genre of its most unique aspect to achieve that. There's enough room for both games catered to the FGC and games aimed at a larger audience. It's no coincidence that all 4 of these upcoming tag fighters are based on existing properties. Naturally, all of these games want to tap into fans of the IP who don't necessarily play fighting games. If Chun-Li Fortnite can't put them onto fighters, maybe a fighting game based on something they like can do the trick. Of course, there's no guarantee that everyone who picks up one of these games will check out others in the genre, but a few of them almost certainly will. That lower skill floor in these games just makes onboarding that much easier. As long as traditional fighters are still being made, I'm all for new games adopting simplified control schemes, assuming the game systems are cleverly built around them and it's not haphazardly thrown in as an afterthought. The game's quality is determined not by their inclusion, but by how they shape its design. Fortnite Battle Royale is consistently among the most played games on every platform. It's not the only Battle Royale, and it's definitely not the only shooter, but it has one unique gimmick that sets it apart from those games: building. The fort in Fortnite. The ability to build is not only the game's most defining feature, but also its most contentious. It's an exceptionally powerful mechanic that controls the pace of every single match. Much of the game's skill expression is focused on your ability to efficiently build, but a large portion of the player base simply aren't interested in learning it. They want to play the game, but don't want to interact with its most defining trait. Some want it to play more like other shooters they're familiar with. Some just don't like the challenge that building presents, and others claim that they're just too employed to be cranking 90s. In response to this, Epic Games would introduce a mode called Zero Build, which, as the name implies, removes building. Such a massive change would naturally have severe implications for not only how the game is played, but also how it's balanced. In lieu of the build mechanic, all characters now have a regenerating shield that's half the size of their normal shield bar. Both are defensive features, but the change from an active mechanic to a more passive one greatly reduces the skill floor. Utility items that grant mobility or create cover are now far more powerful. The game is still Fortnite, but now it's more Knight than Fort. Players who prefer the fort aspect can still get their fix in the classic build mode. The player counts for both modes aren't too far off from each other. Zero Build effectively lowered the skill floor and broadened the appeal of an already massive game, but the original version is still alive and thriving. One didn't have to cannibalize the other, and I don't see why it has to be any different for fighting games. Not everything has to be another Street Fighter 2, but that blueprint created over 30 years ago led to something truly unique. A 1v1 zero-sum game that doesn't care to meet you halfway, but is a ton of fun if you're willing to get past that initial learning curve. And I think that's something worth preserving. That's it for this video. See y'all in the next one.